8 women, 1 storm, all dead. In 1974, Elvira Shatayeva led the Soviet Union's first all-female team up Lenin Peak. They reached the summit as pioneers and died as prisoners of the mountain. This is how breaking barriers became their burial ground. In 1974, the Soviet Union was a place where women were told that they could do anything, as long as men approved it first. Elvira Shatayeva was different. She didn't ask for permission. At 35, Shatayeva had already shattered barriers that most women wouldn't dare approach. She held the title Master of Sport, the highest credential in any sport in the status-conscious Soviet Union. For a woman to achieve this in mountaineering wasn't just rare, it was revolutionary. When American climber Molly Higgins first encountered Shatayeva in the Pamir Mountains, the Soviet woman was standing on a boulder, ordering 4 Russian men around like they were her personal assistants. Spotting an injured American climber, Shatayeva barked, "He is injured, take his pack." Then she turned to Higgins with piercing blue eyes and declared, "I am Elvira Shatayeva. I am Master of Sport. What are you?" Higgins had never met a woman climber like her. Here was a woman who really was capable, she later recalled. She was a heroine, right there. Shatayeva wasn't just breaking barriers for herself. She was building a team that would prove Soviet women could conquer the world's highest peaks without men holding their hands. Her 7 teammates ranged in age from 22 to 35, each selected for their climbing ability and mental toughness. 2 years earlier, Shatayeva had led the first all-women's ascent of Peak Korzhenevskaya, a brutal 7,105-meter giant in Tajikistan. The climb proved that women could handle extreme altitude, technical terrain, and the psychological pressure of high-stakes mountaineering. Now, in the summer of 1974, Shatayeva had set her sights on something even more ambitious. Peak Lenin, at 7,134 meters, wasn't just another mountain. It was a statement. Her team wouldn't just climb it, they would traverse it, becoming the first climbers of any gender to cross from the Lipkin Ridge on the northeast side to the northwest ridge toward Razdelny Peak. The timing couldn't have been more dangerous. The 1974 Pamir's expedition was the first major American climbing meet allowed in the Soviet Union, bringing together 170 climbers from 10 Western countries. The world was watching, and the pressure was immense. American climber Arlene Blum met Shatayeva in the crowded mess tent at base camp. When Blum was ignored by her own American teammates, the striking blonde Russian woman waved her over. "We plan to be the first women's team to do it," Shatayeva told Blum. When Blum suggested they might climb together, Shatayeva's response was swift. "That is impossible." The Soviets wanted the first women's team to be their own. "Soviet women are very strong," Shatayeva declared. "We have collective spirit and we work together." But beneath the confidence, there were warning signs. The Soviet women were climbing with equipment that looked impressive but was dangerously outdated. Their tents were made of cotton with wooden poles and button closures, adequate for weekend camping, but potentially lethal in extreme conditions. American climber Arlene Blum noticed their inadequate tents and old-fashioned boots, thinking how Russian technology seemed to be going more into space than the mountains. The women didn't seem concerned. They had conquered peaks across the Soviet Union and moved through the mountains with the confidence of climbers who had never met a challenge they couldn't overcome. On July 30th, 1974, Elvira Shatayeva led her 7 teammates out of base camp toward Peak Lenin. None of them knew they were walking toward the worst storm the Pamirs had seen in 25 years. Peak Lenin rises from the Pamir Mountains like a sleeping giant, its 7,134-meter summit piercing the thin air between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. In 1974, it wasn't considered the most technical climb in the world, but it was high enough and remote enough to kill you if you made the wrong decision at the wrong moment. Elvira Shatayeva's team had been planning their traverse for months. While other climbers were content to reach Lenin's summit and descend the same route, the Soviet women had chosen something far more ambitious. They would climb the Lipkin Ridge on the northeast side, cross the summit, and descend the northwest ridge toward Razdelny Peak, a traverse that had never been attempted by any climber, male or female. The plan required them to carry full loads to the summit and bivouac on top of the mountain, exposed to whatever weather the Pamirs decided to throw at them. It was bold, technical, and exactly the kind of statement climb that would prove Soviet women belonged among the world's elite mountaineers. On July 30th, 1974, the 8 women left base camp and began their ascent. The early stages went smoothly. They moved as a disciplined unit up the Lipkin route, establishing camps and acclimatizing to the altitude. Other climbers watched their progress with interest and respect. This was clearly a team that knew what they were doing. But the Pamirs had been unusually violent that summer. An earthquake had already triggered avalanches that killed climbers on other peaks. American pilot John Gary Ullen had been crushed in his tent by an avalanche just days earlier. The mountains were unstable, the weather unpredictable, and experienced climbers were dying in conditions that should have been manageable. By August 2nd, Shatayeva's team was nearing the main ridge. The weather was holding, and their progress was steady. Shatayeva radioed base camp with confidence. "Everything so far is so good that we're disappointed in the route." It was the kind of comment that experienced climbers make when a difficult mountain is treating them well, a mixture of relief and almost superstitious worry that things were going too smoothly. On August 3rd, Shatayeva made a decision that would haunt the climbing community for decades. She called a rest day. 3 teams of Soviet men were climbing nearby, clearly positioned to provide support if the women's team needed help. Vladimir Shatayev later wrote that his wife may have deliberately slowed their progress, trying to break loose from the guardianship. The women wanted to prove they could succeed without male assistance, even if it meant taking extra risks. August 4th brought ominous news. Weather forecasters predicted a major storm, and Vitaly Balakov, the master of sport for mountaineering in the entire Soviet Union, recommended that all climbers descend to base camp immediately. The message went out over the radio frequencies, but not everyone received it. Scottish climber Richard Allen North was descending from the summit that afternoon when he encountered the Soviet women walking in a line about 400 feet below the top. Visibility was already dropping, and the wind was picking up. They exchanged greetings in the deteriorating conditions. "You get a bit short of breath up there," North remarked jokingly as he passed them. The women's response would be remembered by everyone who heard the story. "Ah, we are strong, we are women." Those may have been the last words any outsider heard from the team while they were still alive. August 5th dawned with deceptively calm conditions. At other camps on the mountain, climbers received warnings about the approaching storm, but some chose to continue anyway. They had traveled thousands of miles and spent weeks preparing. The temptation to push for the summit was overwhelming. Shatayeva's team reached the summit of Peak Lenin at 5 p.m. on August 5th, 1974. They radioed base camp with the news of their success, their voices carrying the excitement of climbers who had just achieved something historic. They were the first all-female team to reach the summit of a 7,000-meter peak in the Soviet Union. But even as they celebrated, the weather was deteriorating around them. Visibility dropped to 20 to 30 meters, and the wind began to pick up. The women reported that they were having difficulty making out their descent route and had decided to set up their tents to wait for conditions to improve. Base camp agreed with their decision. In zero visibility, attempting to descend technical terrain would be suicidal. Better to wait out the night and descend in the morning when they could see where they were going. That night, the worst storm in 25 years hit the Pamirs. Hurricane-force winds, estimated at 80 to 100 miles per hour, slammed into the summit of Peak Lenin. Temperatures plummeted to -30 to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. The women's cotton tents, designed for weekend camping rather than extreme mountaineering, began to disintegrate under the assault. American climbers lower on the mountain had nylon tents with aluminum poles and zippers, modern equipment that could withstand the storm. They spent the night wearing all their clothes and boots, holding up tent poles as the wind tried to tear their shelters apart. Even with superior equipment, they barely survived. The Soviet women had cotton tents with wooden poles and button closures. According to the official reports, the wind destroyed 2 tents on the first night. August 6th brought 5 inches of new snow at base camp and a foot of snow higher on the mountain. Winds continued at 70 to 80 miles per hour, creating whiteout conditions that made movement impossible. Climbers gathered around radios at base camp, listening through translators as Shatayeva reported their deteriorating situation. At 5 p.m., Shatayeva's voice crackled over the radio with devastating news. One woman had become seriously ill, and another seemed unwell. The team was struggling to maintain their position in the relentless wind and cold. Abalakov's response was immediate and urgent. The women had to descend immediately, he told them. They needed to reach snow where they could dig caves for shelter. The implication was clear, but unspoken. If the sick women couldn't move and adequate shelter couldn't be achieved, they might have to be left behind for the survival of the group. As the women attempted to descend, disaster struck. Irina Lyubimtseva, one of the team's most experienced climbers, died while holding a safety rope for the others. She froze to death in the act of trying to save her teammates. Her body found still gripping the line that was meant to keep them safe. Unable to dig caves in the hard, granular snow, the surviving women managed to erect 2 tents on a ridge just a few hundred feet below the summit. But their situation was hopeless. The hurricane-force winds exploded their remaining tents, blowing away rucksacks, stoves, and mittens, the equipment they needed to survive. 5 women huddled together in a tent without poles, sharing just 3 sleeping bags. Nina Vasilyeva and Valentina Fatayeva, already weakened by altitude and exposure, died during the night. The others pressed close together, trying to share what little warmth remained in their bodies. August 7th brought no relief. If anything, conditions worsened. 2 Japanese climbers, bivouacked lower on the mountain, heard the Russian radio transmissions and deduced that the women were in serious trouble. 2 of them bravely set out to attempt a rescue, but they were blown off their feet by the wind and forced to retreat. Other climbing teams mobilized to help, but they were all too far down the mountain. The storm had turned Peak Lenin into an impregnable fortress, and the 8 women were trapped at its heart. Throughout the day, Shatayeva maintained radio contact with base camp, her voice growing weaker with each transmission. The reports painted a picture of systematic destruction, teammates dying one by one, equipment blown away, hope fading with each passing hour. At 10 a.m., Shatayeva's voice carried a note of despair that chilled everyone listening. "It is very sad here, where it was once so beautiful." By noon, another woman had died. "They are all gone now," Shatayeva reported. That last asked, "When will we see the flowers again?" Others earlier asked about their children. Now it is no use. At 3:30 p.m., Shatayeva's voice returned to the radio, weaker now, carrying the weight of watching her teammates die one by one. "We are sorry. We have failed you. We tried so hard. Now we are so cold." Abalakov, listening in despair at base camp, promised that a rescue was underway. But everyone knew it was a lie born of desperation. No helicopter could fly in those winds. No climber could reach them in time. The 8 women were beyond human help. At 5 p.m., the transmission was unclear, but another woman seemed to have died. Only 3 remained now, huddled together in the ruins of their shelter as winds estimated at 80 to 100 miles per hour continued to tear at everything around them. At 6:30 p.m., Shatayeva's voice crackled over the radio one more time. "Another has died. We cannot go through another night. I do not have the strength to hold down the transmitter button." The pauses between transmissions grew longer. At base camp, climbers gathered around the radio in silence, listening to the systematic destruction of 8 lives. There was nothing they could do but bear witness. At 8:30 p.m. on August 7th, 1974, the final transmission came through. The voice was barely recognizable. Some accounts say it was Shatayeva. Others believe it was Galina Perehodyuk, one of the last survivors. The words were simple, heartbreaking, and final. "Now we are 2, and now we will all die. We are very sorry. We tried, but we could not. Please forgive us. We love you. Goodbye." Twice more, someone pressed the radio button, attempting contact with the world below. But only the howling of the wind came through the speakers. Then silence. August 8th dawned with crystalline skies and gentle winds. The storm that had raged for 3 days was gone, leaving behind a mountain that looked peaceful and innocent under the morning sun. American climbers Alan Steck, Christopher Wren, and Jacques Glidden, who had survived the storm in their camp at 22,000 feet, began their ascent toward the summit. They had no idea what they were about to find. At 23,000 feet, Steck spotted something that made his heart sink, a splash of blue fabric against the white snow. As they climbed higher, the terrible truth became clear. Bodies were scattered across the summit area, some partially buried, others sprawled across the remains of torn tents. Wren recognized Elvira Shatayeva first. The woman who had commanded respect from every climber in base camp lay still in the snow, her bright blue jacket a stark contrast against the white slope. Beyond her, they found the others, some half buried in snow, 3 sprawled across a torn tent that had been futilely pitched on a scooped-out snow platform. Irina Lyubimtseva was found exactly as the radio reports had described, frozen while holding a rope that led downhill, her final act an attempt to secure a safety line for her teammates. The 8th woman, Nina Vasilyeva, was discovered beneath the others when Elvira's husband and a support crew went up a week later to retrieve the bodies. 4 Japanese climbers arrived at the same time as the Americans. Together, they walked among the bodies, crying as they surveyed the scene of devastation. Shreds of tent fabric and broken wooden poles were scattered across the snow, like the remnants of a battle that had been fought and lost. Steck borrowed the Japanese team's radio to call base camp. His voice was shaken as he reported, "Something very strange, very sad has happened here." That night, all 3 American survivors were certain that they heard women's voices calling from outside their tent. Russian voices, Steck later recalled. "We'd opened the tent and no one was there." The 8 women who had climbed Peak Lenin to prove that Soviet women were strong had paid the ultimate price for their ambition. They had reached the summit as pioneers and died as prisoners of the mountain, victims of a storm that showed no mercy in equipment that couldn't protect them when it mattered most. The bodies of 8 Soviet women lay scattered across Peak Lenin's summit for a week before they could be recovered. When Vladimir Shatayev, Elvira's husband, finally reached the scene with a recovery team, he found them exactly as the American climbers had described, still together, still connected by the ropes that had bound them in life and death. The investigation that followed revealed a tragedy born of multiple failures. The women's cotton tents with wooden poles had been no match for hurricane-force winds that modern nylon shelters barely survived. Their ambitious traverse plan had left them exposed on the summit when the worst storm in 25 years arrived. The pressure to represent Soviet women's climbing had driven them to continue when other teams turned back. But perhaps most heartbreaking was the loyalty that killed them. Radio transcripts showed that the women had multiple opportunities to save some of the team by abandoning the sick and dying. They refused every time. "We would not leave our comrades after all they have done for us," Shatayeva had declared, even as death closed in around them. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the international climbing community. 13 climbers died in the Pamirs that summer, but the loss of 8 women in a single storm became the expedition's defining disaster. Their story was largely forgotten outside climbing circles, overshadowed by more famous Everest tragedies and the passage of time. Today, women climbers routinely tackle the world's highest peaks, their competence no longer questioned. The barriers that Elvira Shatayeva and her team died trying to break have long since fallen. But on Peak Lenin, the mountain remembers. 8 women proved that Soviet women were strong. The storm proved that sometimes strength isn't enough.